Why do men cry less than women? Men are good. This is part 3 of Why Men Cry Less. In part 1, we talked about precarious manhood. We talked about the dependency gap. We talked about the tear ducts, men's tear ducts being larger. And then in part 2, we talked about testosterone and prolactin as being involved in the lack of tears for men and the abundance of tears for women. Today we're going to talk about something a little bit different. You know, the research for years about testosterone, they've been trying so hard to connect testosterone with aggression and with violence, and they just strike out over and over again until lately what they've found is it's not about that at all. It's more about striving for status. At any rate, the research has been completely lacking in anything about testosterone and emotions. There's almost nothing out there about what's the impact of testosterone on one's emotions. Very little on that. So we have to kind of look around in different places to try and find something that might tell us a little bit about that. And there's an interesting place we can look to see, and that is with trans men. There's a guy named Max Valerio who wrote a book called The Testosterone Files back in 2006, I think. It was a while back. It's a great book. Max was a poet and also a writer, and the book's well written, and he really describes a lot of issues in the book that are fascinating to read. But of particular interest for us with this part 3 is Max's talk about when he took these large doses of testosterone, what happened to his emotional state? What went on emotionally? You know, there's a lot of other things that happen, but Max is very articulate in describing what happened to him on an emotional level as he went from taking very little testosterone to taking a whole lot, alpha male size doses of testosterone. So in some ways, this kind of replaces the research. It doesn't replace, but it gives us a general idea of what might happen with testosterone, and it tells us a little bit about what probably happens to boys when they're younger and men as they learn to deal with these larger doses of testosterone. So let's look at Max's quote. You know, Max, an early quote, he says, "On estrogen, I was more relaxed. Now I can hardly sit still. I find myself more confident, expansive, and cocky. Now I understand teenage boys. Everything has a sexual subtext." So it's interesting. He's saying that estrogen, he was more relaxed. You know, less so with testosterone. Now he's getting cocky and confident. Does that tell you anything about stereotypes that you've heard before? Think about it. Yeah, so Max is just getting started. The next one he talks about, Max says, "I've noticed that when I am emotional, it's more difficult to put my feelings into words. This is where women have a distinct advantage. I find it very hard now to explain or articulate my feelings when I'm actually in the throes of feeling them." Okay, so what Max is saying is that with the increased testosterone, he's having a hard time articulating his emotions. How many times have I seen in therapist's office, the therapist says to the woman, "What are you feeling?" Boom, she goes on an articulate sort of, she articulates all that she's feeling. Then she turns to the guy and she says, "And what are you feeling?" And he has a hard time articulating, he has a hard time putting it into words. He knows what's going on, but he can't find the words to put it into. This is exactly what Max is talking about. I find it very hard now to explain or articulate my feelings when I'm actually in the throes of feeling them. This is really important for men to understand and for women to understand, because when women understand this, they don't judge men so harshly for not being able to give all kinds of flowery details about the way they're feeling. It's likely that testosterone is muting that. It's not allowing the man to be able to put words into it. And we can think for evolutionarily why it might be, because testosterone, we talked about the part 2 where testosterone wants to mute the emotions in order for the man to take care of things on the border, on the perimeter. He's got to take care of things. He can't be breaking down and crying. When the policeman goes to a car accident, he can't be tearing up and crying. He's got to take care of things, right? So articulating emotions is lower down on the list of what the men need to do. So let's look at another thing that Max says here. Slowly, I began to realize that if I'd felt this way as female, I would have cried easily, released this pent-up sadness and frustration through tears. Now I can't. I find it impossible to weep. I find it impossible to weep. So what Max is saying is, with larger doses of testosterone, the tears dry up, just as we talked about in the first and second parts of this. The tears dry up with larger doses of testosterone. And he's very clear. He says, as a female, I would have just cried. I would have cried it out, and that would have been the end of it. Women need to understand that men probably have the same emotions, but they don't have the tears to release it. When women understand that, their compassion for men goes up, because men find very different ways to process those emotions. And I'm sure you've seen from the books I've written, whatever, that some of those different ways and how they work. But this is part of the reason is testosterone. I find it impossible to weep. That's so critical for us to understand. Okay, next one by Max. What does Max say? I believed that men could cry just as much as women if they would just let themselves go. Men were victims of a masculine ethos that forbade tears, that made them into unfeeling, seething septic tanks of repressed pain, ready to lash out. I was wrong. Wow. Max's whole view of men starts to shift. It shifts over. Max thought before this testosterone that men were just stuffing things and not crying on purpose and holding it in. They were repressed, seething septic tanks, right? Ay, ay, ay. Now Max is saying, wow, I was wrong. Now that I see in my own body what's happening to my emotions with this testosterone stuff, I really have some compassion for men. Thank you, Max. Well-written book, and thank you for chronicling this difference in what happened to you as you took these huge doses of tea. Anyway, we all need to learn that men are probably going to cry less. Doesn't mean men don't cry at all. Men do cry. And that's a good thing. It's not. We're not saying it's a bad thing. But in general, men's access to those tears is probably going to be less than women's. And we need to learn that so that we can keep from passing judgment on men for being not like women, for crying out loud. Okay. Because men are good, as are you. Yeah, come see me on Patreon. We'll see you. Men are good.